Hi, welcome back to Homestead Healing. My name is Jenny, and this week I am going to be making and canning some wild huckleberry jam. My neighbor gave me 3 gallons of huckleberries, and we have decided to preserve them in a delicious jam. So I will show you step by step my method and recipe for making huckleberry jam, as well as the best way to can and preserve your jam, the supplies and tools you will be needing as well. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. So if you plan to be canning your jam, you're obviously going to be needing a canner. This is a water bath canner. It does have a rack inside as well that is removable, so you can easily lift your jars and replace them into the canner. This is a very important tool if you're going to be making canned jam and you want it to last and be shelf stable. The next thing you're going to be needing is jars. So depending on the size of the jar the recipe calls for, or you choose to use, these are 8-ounce mason jars. You want to make sure you're always using new lids. So you may need to buy new lids as well, but make sure that you have enough mason jars to do your recipe as well. Also, you're going to be needing a nice size pot with a wide enough bottom. It's important that you do not double your recipe. I'll get more into that later, to make sure that you can cook your berries nice and low to the burner. You'll be needing a spoon to stir your sugar and berries and pectin, and also a scoop to remove and put the berries in the jar. A few more supplies related to canning would be this funnel here. This will go inside of your jars with the lid removed to help you scoop your hot jam into the jar without it spilling, splattering everywhere. Another one would be, this is a magnetic lid lifter. So you will use this after you boil to sanitize and heat your lids, and to lift it out of the boiling water and remove the lid and place it back onto the jar after you've put your jam inside. This is a very important tool here. This is actually a headspace measuring tool, and you will use it. There's tiny little measurements written on the side. So whether your recipe calls for a 1/4 inch headspace, a 1/2 inch headspace, you will use this to measure inside of your jar like so. I'll be doing this later to measure my headspace. You can also use it to pop the bubbles inside. You don't want to leave any bubbles. You don't want too much headspace or too little headspace, or you could get mold, or your jam just might not preserve as well, discoloration. This is also a can lifter. I don't use this very often, but once you have preserved jar lifter, once you have added your jam to the jars, you can use this to lift your jars, your hot jars, if you need to move them. So typically I just leave my jars where they are once they have been removed from the canner. This one I do use quite a bit. So this I use to lift the hot jars out of my water bath canner, or whatever kind of pot you might be using to boil your hot water to put your jars in. This will help you remove the hot jars from that boiling water as well. This one I use quite a bit. I have another one. It's missing one of the rubber pieces on here, but you do use this to lift the jars out of the boiling hot water and place them down after you have preserved them for their boiling time. So whether or not you will be canning and preserving your jam, or just baking some jam to put in the fridge or freezer for a shorter time period, you will need to make sure that you have the necessary ingredients. So you need to make sure that you have enough berries to make your recipe. Too little berries could result in the recipe just not setting as well or coming together as you had hoped flavor-wise. You might need pectin. This is powdered pectin. I'm using this one in today's recipe. There's also liquid pectin. There's low sugar pectin if you prefer that as well. You can also make jam with no pectin, and you will need sugar, and you will just need to cook it at a longer and slower temperature to help that set and gel. Another thing that would be important in this recipe and most jam recipes is lemons. It will help to counteract the sweetness, give it a nice flavor, but the lemons also help the jam to set. So these are the supplies you will need, along with some sugar, of course, to make your jam. So I also use this Blue Book Ball Guide to Preserving quite often. I have used a few recipes in this. It is a really good recipe book as well, but I mostly use this to look back and make sure that I'm following all the steps correctly. So especially if you are new to canning or you're canning something you haven't canned previously, this will give you all of the guidelines and tips and tricks to make sure that you are doing everything correctly. So this is a good book to have. So now that we have gone over all the supplies, let's go ahead and get into it. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is washing my jars and lids and the supplies that I will need today. So even though I do keep all of my canning supplies in a nice sealed container and washed and clean, I like to just give them a nice rinse and clean them off before using them. Once all of my jars and supplies are washed, I will fill my canning pot about halfway with water to start boiling my jars. Next, I'm going to be washing the lemons really well because you're going to be using the lemon rind. I accidentally cut this lemon first. It is much easier to grate the rind with a whole lemon, but you first will want to grate the rind and then juice the lemon for your recipe. Next, I'm going to be adding my 4 cups of huckleberries. Mine were frozen huckleberries, so I did let them thaw on the counter for just a little while to make them easier to scoop out. So I'm just using a measuring cup to measure those, and then adding the 4 tablespoons of fresh squeezed lemon juice and the lemon rind as well. Next, you will add your classic powdered pectin. It is also 4 tablespoons of classic pectin. Now, this differs from many recipes that I found online, so I did have to change this. Classic powdered pectin should always be added to cold berries, not heated berries. Heated berries, you would want to use a liquid pectin toward the end. But so I did change that portion and I had much better results. Now that my water has started to boil, I'm going to go ahead and start adding my jars, and you want to heat them for about 10 minutes. This will help to prevent your jars from breaking when you add the hot jam, and it also sterilizes the jars. I also placed a smaller pot of just a little bit of water on the stove as well to start heating that to add my lids to. You want to also heat those lids for about 10 minutes. The berries have now been heating on the stove at medium heat for a few minutes, so they are ready to be mashed if you choose to. I'm just using a potato masher. You could use an immersion blender if you'd like, or you could just leave them whole as well. So now I'm going to be adding my sugar. It is 4 cups of sugar for this recipe. It does seem like a lot of sugar, but you are not eating a ton of the jam. It's just a small amount, and it is a good amount of sugar to go with the tartness of the berries. It makes a great flavor. Once your berries come to a full rolling boil, you'll want to stir them constantly for 1 more minute. A rolling boil means that you cannot stir down the boiling berries. So mine is there now. And after 1 minute, it is ready to remove from the heat. I had tried to triple a berry recipe, a jam recipe, not too long ago. And because of that, the jam didn't set. So now I like to make sure to do a gel test. So you put a little bit of the jam on a cold plate that was in the freezer for a few minutes and make sure that it starts to gel. So you can also place that plate into the freezer for a minute and pull it out. And if it says start to set, you know you are ready and your jam is ready and it's going to set. I also learned an important lesson not to double or especially triple a recipe, because a jam should be cooked in a wide bottom pot so that the jam is close to the heat that'll allow the sugar to dissolve and boil, and it will help the jam to set. So I will no longer be doubling a recipe in the future. I am now scooping all of the jam into my hot jars that I removed from my boiling water. And I am trying to leave the proper amount of headspace as I go without measuring, but when I'm finished, I will go back in and check and make sure that the headspace is the proper amount, usually between a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch of headspace. And then you want to go in with a clean, warm, wet towel and wipe the rims of each jar to make sure there's no jam around the lid or the rim to prevent the lid from properly sealing. So when your lids are nice and hot and have been boiling for 10 minutes, you will go ahead and grab a lid for each jar, and then you will tighten the bands over the lids just to fingertip tightness. You don't want to make them too tight. So just what you can do with your fingertips. And you can use one of those canning tools to help you hold the jars here, or just hold it by the bands that are not hot. So then you want to bring your jars, once they are filled, and place them in your boiling water. You want to make sure there is an inch of hot boiling water above the jars once they are placed in there into the canner. And you want to make sure that your jars are not touching as well. This is another reason you don't want to double a recipe. You might be trying to overcrowd your jars into your canner, because you definitely want to boil them when they're hot. So you will process them for the recommended processing time. For me, this recipe called for 10 minutes, but you also want to double check and make sure your elevation doesn't require extra time. While my jars were processing, I went ahead and did a second batch. So right now the second batch is processing in the canner, and it is time to try the jam. It is still a little warm. It hasn't fully set yet, but it just smells so amazing and everybody wants to try it. So putting a little bit here on a sourdough English muffin, and it was so delicious. Everyone loved it. So that is all for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you being here. If you haven't already, please subscribe and like, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Hi, welcome back to Homestead Healing. My name is Jenny, and this week I am making Huckleberry Jam.